I remember the taste of iron in my mouth when the words were first spoken, and I remember how the lumen above my head stuttered at the exact same time as if the building itself took a breath before it exhaled my fate. The man who told me did not look up from his slate. He wore an administratum robe, the color of parchment left too long under a feeble sun, and his left hand ended in augmetic digits that clicked softly as they danced over runes. Citizen Rin Malvek, designation 44, Theta 113, you have been selected for the Emperor's service. The syllables were dry and precise, and not meant for comfort. I stood barefoot on a steel floor that hummed faintly with the current of 1,000 unfeeling machines, and I said there must be some mistake because the mouth and the lungs do their work, even when the soul is falling through a hole in the present world. He marked something on the slate with a gesture that felt like a verdict. There is no mistake. Your markers have been verified. Your presence is required at Sanctum Gate Delta 42 by the 19th hour. Report with only what you wear. He said nothing about farewells. He said nothing about hope. He did not need to. I left the gray chamber, and the door sealed behind me with a sigh like a patient dying. The corridor out of the Office of Petitioners ran in a long line of stained plasteel and buzzing conduits, and for a time I walked without knowing I had moved. My reflection in the transport tube window looked like a stranger who was trying to borrow my face and not succeeding. 31 years carved into soft features that never expected to be noticed. Oil darkened the furrows of my hands, and a silver line marked my left cheek, where a falling gear had kissed me 5 years before. I kept thinking that the Emperor could not possibly need these hands and this face for anything that mattered, and then I remembered that what was needed had nothing to do with worth. The hab door recognized my tag and let me in for the last time. The room was 8 by 6, and honest about its limits. One cot bolted to the wall, one desk bolted to the floor, one ration unit that asked for tokens and returned squares of corpse starch that tasted of old promises. A cracked picked frame sat on the desk with the faces of my parents caught in a smile that belonged to another century, and above the cot a bent vent dripped a slow rhythm into a rusted cup. I sat on the cot and waited and found that waiting was not a passive thing. Waiting has teeth. It chews through the skin of hours and leaves the bone of minutes raw and shining. I tried to read the Primer Imperialis for guidance, and the words slid away from my eyes like eels. I tried to eat, and the starch turned to ash before I could swallow. I tried to sleep, and the lumen over my head explored new pitches of whining until the sound made my molars ache. When the 19th hour chimed across the block, I stood with the relief of a man who has decided that falling is better than hanging on. The transport capsule at Sanctum Gate Delta 42 looked like something preserved from a time when craft was still a prayer answered by the hands that said it. The walls were paneled with wood that had kept the memory of trees, and the fittings were brass, polished until they held the light softly. Incense sweet and chemical threaded the air. An adept with a brass mask for a face gestured us inside, and 8 of us obeyed. We did not speak as the doors sealed and the capsule rocked into motion. Silence in a place like that becomes a presence you sit beside. I counted the people, because numbers are something you can hold when the rest of your life is slipping. A scribe girl with ink ghosted under her fingernails pressed a tin aquila into her palm until her knuckles whitened. A Prometheum worker with the breath of a furnace coughed into a rag he did not bother to hide. A youth with buzzed hair could not keep his knee from jittering. A woman with hands shaped by soil that Terra no longer owned mouthed a litany at the speed of panic. 2 men who looked like brothers without being related kept glancing at the adepts as if they might learn the rules by watching. One old man with a face like weathered leather stared at nothing, and I suspected he had started his leaving before the door had shut. The capsule descended, and the world outside our small window changed. Iron ribs gave way to stone bones. The ceiling arched higher and higher until the lumen strips became constellations. Reliefs crowded the walls in a riot of saints and monsters, and symbols that moved when your gaze crawled across them. Servo skulls floated past like quiet thoughts with burning eyes. The air thickened with incense, and the taste of ozone, and the memory of dust. I saw manufactories open like mouths full of bronze teeth, machines standing in ranks and speaking to each other in the clipped language of the Mechanicus. Servitors stood in their pens and counted with their eyes the hours that no longer belonged to them. I glimpsed a library where the pages were the color of old flesh, and the scribes who tended them wore gloves so thin I wondered if they were skin. We descended again, and the walls grew strange. The stone looked older than kings, and yet the patterns in it felt like something grown rather than carved, like veins threading a giant limb. Heat swelled and receded as if the palace breathed and could not catch itself. The lumen sputtered and flickered, and once it failed entirely, and in that darkness there rose a vibration so low that it seemed to travel through the marrow of my bones. It had the shape of a scream, and the patience of a mountain. When light returned, I found the scribe girl staring at me as if she had heard my thoughts, and I looked away because I did not want to confirm that she had. The adepts in their red robes did not speak. They moved precisely with motions that had been taught to machines and then taught to men. When one of them turned, I saw a rosary of binary prayer coils swinging at his waist, each bead etched with the sign of the cog. We passed security rings that grew less human as we sank. The first ring had soldiers in flak with the steady boredom of men trained to endure. The second ring had scutarii with lenses where once there had been eyes and limbs that clicked and folded. The third ring had guardians whose armor looked like it had been carved from the idea of gold rather than the metal, and they did not move at all. The adepts did not ask them permission. They waited until some signal none of us could sense admitted us. The air beyond that threshold did not admit the casual kind of breath. You had to convince it. You had to ask, with lungs and chest and the will to keep asking. The corridor ran out into a space that felt like the inside of a bell that had been ringing for 10,000 years and had only chosen this moment to pause. The statues here were not saints I knew. Their faces were pulled into expressions that refused to pick between joy and grief, and the artist had captured the second before a scream breaks into song. The floors had no dust. The walls had no stain. The silence had a texture like pressed velvet, and the taste of iron lingered at the back of the throat. We walked a long while, and in that walk, I discovered a new measurement of distance. It was not counted by steps or markers or time. It was counted by what I was leaving behind with each footfall. The hab, with its bent vent and its dripping cup. The rations that had turned to ash. The cracked pict of parents who had loved me exactly once and then died in the ordinary way that people do on a world built for anything but living. The child I had been who ran through lower hive corridors and collected sparks in his hands and believed they were stars that would do what he told them. Each of those things peeled away and slid behind me and refused to follow. At the end of that corridor, a gate rose so high that looking at its far lintel made my neck ache. It did not look like a door. It looked like a verdict. On either side stood men who had been made into something better than men, and their armor caught the lumen and made the lumen wish it was brighter. They did not move, and yet I knew that if one of us had stumbled, they would have produced a spear out of light and duty, and that spear would have been inside the body, before the body understood that it had erred. We bowed our heads without being told because some instincts were written into us by ancestors who had never seen such things but had always understood them. Beyond the gate, the temperature changed. It did not grow colder or warmer so much as correct to a value that felt deliberate. The scent changed as well, less incense now and more machine oil sweetened by age until it became something close to perfume. The adept spoke at last, and each word came through a vox grill that flattened it. Citizens, follow. Do not speak. Do not diverge. Do not touch what is not offered. We followed and discovered that the floor had been polished to such a degree that it remembered every foot that had crossed it. I looked down, and the reflection that looked back was pale and small and unarmed. We reached a junction where another procession crossed our path. They were hooded and robed and silent, and between them walked a figure in a garment, the color of midnight, that consumed light rather than reflected it. The air around that person fell away. The noise of our breath stuttered. A sister of silence moved past, and all the quiet voices that thrummed in the back of my skull since childhood curled up and whimpered and hid. I had never known that silence could be a weight that pressed against the ribs, but I felt it then, and I loved it in the way a drowning man loves a rope tied to a post on dry land. The sister never looked at me, and still I felt measured and judged and found to be exactly as small as I feared. After they passed, the world returned in a rush, and I heard one of the brothers who were not brothers vomit behind his teeth and swallow it again. We walked deeper, and I saw the old signs of the telepathica. Words etched in metals that human tongues do not pronounce. Seals inked in pigments that refuse to fade. Bones of creatures not native to any world that still spins in our age assembled into warning shapes. I saw prayer wheels turning very slowly in the breadth of the palace, and I saw servo cherubs whose smiles were carved too wide. We entered a hall where rows of novices sat in rapt attention, while a lector with a carved ebony staff spoke of the light that steers the fleets of man. His words were careful, and he did not say what fed that light, only that it must never be allowed to dim. The novices nodded because they had not yet learned the true price of agreement. We were ushered past and through a gate that showed us a mural of Terra as it once was, clothed in green and blue, a planet that would have made promises honestly. And then the mural shifted when I blinked, and Terra wore a crown of iron and ash, and its oceans were a memory that someone had written down and then misplaced. One of the adepts turned and counted us, and his mask clicked as though pleased that the number had not changed. He led us to a platform that slid without sound along a channel cut into living rock, and the journey became a longer one than the capsule had offered. We passed pillars that held up not only the weight of the palace, but the burden of years. We passed vault doors with warning sigils that made the eyes water if you tried to read them. We passed a shrine where a single candle burned with a blue flame that refused to die, and the woman with soil on her hands reached for it with a look on her face that made me want to weep. And a Skitarius raised a palm, and she stopped and whispered an apology to the candle as if it were a friend she had almost insulted. Eventually, the platform delivered us to a landing where the air tasted like storms. I could feel the hair on my arms rise and fall as if something brushed past that I could not see. A long corridor waited for us, lit by lumen bowls that burned steadily with a light that was not entirely light. At its far end, a set of doors stood shaped like the wings of an eagle with two heads. The heads looked at each other as though neither trusted the other to keep its promises. The adepts formed us into a line, and it surprised me that I obeyed easily. When they opened the doors, the light beyond was not bright in the way of day. It was bright in the way of revelation. I felt my pupils clamp down, and my heart try to follow them. The room we entered was circular, and the ceiling was a dome that had swallowed the night and held on to every star it had taken. Around the circumference rose alcoves, and in each sat a throne, and in each throne sat a person. And I did not understand what I was seeing until the smell of antiseptic and hot metal and something like burned cinnamon reached me, and the prap sound of soft machines knitting with slow intent filled my ears. The bodies were alive. The bodies were breathing. The bodies were part of something that was not a room and not a machine and not a prayer, but all of those at once. The center of the chamber was raised, and on it something waited under veils of cables and glass, and a shadow that did not belong to anything in sight. I knew, without wanting the knowledge, that this was not yet the heart. This was only a vestibule for a heart that the mind could not hold without cracking. The scribe girl made a small sound that was almost a word and almost a surrender, and an adept touched her elbow and guided her forward with the care of a butcher lifting a cut of meat that must not be marred. The Prometheum worker set his jaw in a way I recognized from the men who had watched me pull a casing line back into service while a foreman screamed about quotas from a balcony. The youth swallowed and swallowed again, as if he could drown whatever was rising in his throat. The old man walked with the peace of someone who had put his memories in order. I took a breath that did not satisfy, and told myself that I was still a single person and that I could keep being one if I clenched hard enough around the idea. The lie tasted kind. It dissolved anyway. We had arrived at the threshold of sacred service, and there would be no turning back and no hiding in the folds of the palace and no bribing the adepts with tokens or prayers. The machine needed what the machine needed. The Emperor needed what the Emperor needed. Humanity needed a light to steer by, and I had been counted among the fuel. I looked at my hands and imagined for a moment that they were steady. Then I lifted my head and walked with the others into the place where names cease to be names and become only notes in a choir that must never stop singing. The chamber breathed around us, though it had no lungs, and every surface seemed carved to remind us that nothing here was made for men to understand. The air was warm and smelled of sanctity and machine oil, a sweetness that clung to the back of the throat until swallowing felt like swallowing fire. The adepts guided us across a floor that shone like it had been polished by centuries of terrified feet, and in the alcoves that ringed the walls the thrones waited. At first I thought they were empty, carved from a material darker than stone and lit by crystals that pulsed faintly with their own rhythm. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw that each throne was occupied. The bodies were not corpses, though they might as well have been. Their eyes stared sightless, rolled back to show pale whites. Tubes pierced their throats and skulls, needles fixed into arms, cables threaded through flesh, as if the body itself was little more than a sheath for wiring. Their chests rose and fell, shallow and automatic, and their mouths sometimes moved as if whispering words only the machine could hear. I wanted to look away, but the adepts did not permit us to linger, and so I walked past thrones that hummed with power, stolen from human lives. Thrones that devoured individuality and returned only fuel for a light I had been taught to bless. The center of the chamber rose like an altar, a dais supporting a throne unlike the others. It was larger, older, carved from a substance that drank light instead of reflecting it, surrounded by crystalline growths that looked diseased yet pulsed with internal fire. The cables that linked the outer thrones fed into this heart, as veins feed into the body. Something stirred behind its glassy surface, and I thought I saw a face, human but distorted, watching us with eyes that had carried centuries of sorrow. The adepts stopped us in a line, and one of them spoke, his voice flattened by the vox in his mask. "Behold, citizens, here begins the transformation of service. Here individual existence ends and sacred duty begins." One of us, the girl with the Aquila pendant, began to cry silently, her tears running down to stain the brass on her chest. The old man with Prometheum scars reached for her hand, though his own shook. A boy at the end of the line trembled so violently that I thought he might collapse before they ever touched him. The adepts called a name. The girl was first. She stumbled forward, clutching her pendant so tightly that her knuckles cracked. She looked back at us once with eyes wide and terrified, and then allowed them to seat her in the throne. Straps tightened with a hiss. Tubes slithered into her arms, into her spine, into her skull. The crystals reached for her like living fingers. When they touched her flesh, she convulsed and screamed. The sound echoed into every surface and seemed to become part of the stone. Then her body went slack. Her eyes rolled upward. Her mouth open, but voiceless. Instruments mounted by the adepts glowed, and one of them announced in a tone that could not have cared less. Connection achieved. 96% efficiency. Resonance within acceptable bounds. She was gone. She was something else now. Her individuality erased. Her life consumed by the machine that demanded her soul. We watched in silence because silence was safer than words. Then the old Prometheum worker was called. He went without protest and seated himself like a man who had accepted fire long ago. "Worked with flame all my life," he muttered. "Fitting I should become flame in the end." His transformation was quieter, less violent, but no less final. His eyes emptied, and the machine drank him whole. One by one, the others followed. The youth, sobbing soundlessly as the crystal filaments burrowed into him. The soil-handed woman who whispered defiance even as her body convulsed under the invasion of wires. Each face disappeared. Each voice was silenced. And always the instruments glowed and the adepts confirmed resonance, efficiency, acceptable parameters. I stood there and felt my skin crawl as I understood finally what all the whispers had never truly said. The Astronomicon, the light that guides ships through the warp, is not powered by miracle or by faith. It is powered by us, by human souls burned and bound into a choir that never stopped screaming across the Immaterium. 1,000 a day, every day, for 10,000 years. The scale of it pressed on my chest until I could barely breathe. I thought of the ships moving through the dark, of colonists settling distant worlds, of guardsmen transported to wars they would not survive, of merchants hauling cargo across systems, of pilgrims seeking shrines on distant rocks, All of them alive, because here in the depths of the palace, men and women like me were devoured. I wanted to shout that it was wrong, that the Emperor could not demand this. But the thought died before it reached my lips, because the custodian still stood in my memory, and the adepts still watched with masked faces that did not blink. A voice moved through the chamber then, deep and mechanical. The voice of a system that had spoken for millennia. You will be processed, in order of designation. You will not resist. You will sustain the light that guards mankind. There is no greater honor. The boy who had twitched since the capsule began to wail like a child, his thin body shaking. But two adepts took him by the arms and guided him forward, their motions as calm as the motion of a clock. His cries turned to choking sobs when the tubes slid into his skin. His head jerked back when the crystal growths touched him. Then silence. Another voice confirmed integration. Another soul extinguished and consumed. My hands sweated until I could not feel my fingers. My knees shook, and I wondered if they would collapse before my turn came. I thought of running, but the thought died instantly. There was nowhere to run. Not in this palace, not on this world, not anywhere in the galaxy that did not live beneath the shadow of the same light. The adepts called another name, and another of us walked to the throne. I watched each one, and in each transformation I saw myself reflected, my own fate rehearsed again and again. I tried to imagine that the Emperor himself watched, that his gaze touched us here in this place, and I wanted to believe that he remembered each of us, that he saw our faces and mourned us even as he devoured us. But I remembered the face I had seen flicker within the central throne, a face warped by centuries of pain, and I wondered if even he still knew how to grieve. The adepts turned at last, and the sound of my name came through their vox. Rin Malvek, designation 44 Theta 113. Report. My feet did not move at first. The silence of the chamber grew heavier, pressing against me until I staggered forward because standing still was worse. The throne was warm when I touched it, as if it had been waiting, and the straps coiled around me before I could resist. The first needle slid into my arm, burning cold. Another pierced my neck. Another drove into my skull. Pain flared, but worse than pain was the sensation of something vast and alien rifling through my memories. My childhood in the lower hive. The first time I fixed a broken casing line and felt pride. The face of a girl I had loved for a handful of weeks before she was taken to another sector. The rare taste of real meat on Foundation Day. The sound of rain against rusted roofs. Each memory was drawn out and held, weighed, prepared to be dissolved. And in that invasion I felt another presence. Older, heavier, immeasurably sad. It was not the cold analysis of the machine, but something more. A fragment of the Emperor himself, bound into this system, watching and enduring the death of 1,000 souls each day for 10,000 years. It whispered into my dissolving mind, and its words were heavy with sorrow. I am sorry, so very sorry. My breath caught, my eyes filled, and for the first time since my name had been called, I believed. The Emperor knew, the Emperor remembered, and still the Emperor demanded. I felt the needles as points of cold entering flesh, and I felt them again as lines of heat crawling into places that do not have names, and then there was a tearing that was not tearing. A pressure that pressed from inside to out, and from outside to in, until direction did not matter. Memory unspooled as if each day of my life had been a thread wound in a careful coil, and the machine had seized the coil and begun to draw it out through an eye that was too small for the task. I wanted to clench around each image and keep it, but the grip of a man is not enough when a world has been engineered to take. The smell of my father's coat after a shift, hot metal and sweat, and a sweetness that came from the cheap liquor he saved for feast days, slipped away from me. The sound of rain on the hab roof that one summer when the vents failed and we slept in our shoes, slid from my fingers. The taste of real meat on Foundation Day moved out of reach like a boat leaving a dock that crumbles. In the gaps where memory had been, another sensation rose like heat shimmering over a road. It was the presence that had spoken inside my skull. Older than any city, older than the palace, older than my ability to imagine what older means. I am sorry, the presence had said. and the words did not repeat, but the meaning did, filling the hollow spaces the machine had made, not as comfort, but as acknowledgement, which is a leaner food and more honest. Then the world opened sideways and I fell. Not down, not up, not through, but into a brightness that did not belong to light, and a sound that was not sound at all, but intention arranged so that minds could bear it. The choir took me the way a sea takes a river, not to erase it at once, but to show it how to move in company. I felt the girl with ink under her nails, a fast and delicate mind that had always seen patterns in numbers and now saw patterns in emptiness. I felt the Prometheum worker, a slow and stubborn rhythm like a forge that had forgotten how to stop, and the heat of him gave strength to the places where the choir thinned. I felt the youth whose knee had never stopped shaking and discovered that inside the shaking there had always been an engine of fierce generosity. I felt the woman whose hands were stained with soil and found that her defiance did not burn, it rooted, and the roots held when turbulence rose against us. We were many and we were one, and neither word fit, but both would have to serve. Around and through and beneath us lay the Emperor like a star that had grown tired of pretending to be a man. He did not speak again, not as words, not to me, but I knew he was there the way you know a mountain is there even when fog covers it. We were arranged. That is the only word I have. We were set into places within the shape of the Astronomicon as joints are set, as gears are placed, as rafters are slotted beneath a roof. The adepts moved outside the walls we no longer needed, and their instruments and their prayers folded our raw pain into harmonics. The shape we took was not simple, not a beam, not a flame, but a woven spiral that turned upon itself and held an axis that ran through Terra and through the throne and through what remained of the Emperor's will. It tightened and loosened in strict cadence. When it tightened, we burned harder and the beacon pushed farther into the black, and when it loosened, we smoldered and recovered, and in the ebbed little drifts of our old selves, whispered across the currents like leaves carried on water. Time changed its posture. The moments of binding lengthened into something like hours, and then contracted, until a whole day felt like a cord held and released. And in that pulse, you could see a convoy of ships step from the shallows of normal space into the froth of the warp, and in the next, you could see them again on the edge of a distant system drawing deep breaths of real sunlight. We were the blade that cut a path, and we were the hand that holds the blade steady, and if our fingers bled, that was the price. The warp pressed in like weather that had teeth and eyes. I learned the smell of it, which is not a smell, but it sits on the tongue anyway. Copper and salt and something like crushed flowers left in the dark. It changed color faster than thought, a dance of impossible hues that wounded if you stared. Shapes leaned near the surface, curious and hungry, and sometimes they ran alongside the light we made, like wolves trotting beside a fence. Their eyes looked like windows into rooms where nothing good had ever happened. They could not pass through where our music was strong. Where it thinned, they pressed harder, and then the Emperor's weight would settle, and our cords would tighten and the fence would hold. Far away, in places we could not name, navigators opened the eyes in their foreheads and saw us not as we felt ourselves, but as a single presence burning through torment. They were born to that sight. Their ancestors had bargained for it. They guided the lives of men by looking into a truth that breaks ordinary minds. And when their gaze met our arrayed suffering, we felt the tug of their requests like the pull of tides. A ship above a dead world asked for a route that would avoid a storm pregnant with hate. A convoy carrying grain begged for speed, for the hungry do not forgive late arrivals. A patrol sent to a quiet edge felt the signal of a predator hidden in the dark and turned aside because our light slipped around the ambush and wrote a new path in a brighter hand. I discovered that intention travels in this place. Not prayer as I had learned it in the Primer Imperialis, but something more raw. The focused need of 1,000 crews, the discipline of a captain with no margin left to lose, the stubborn hope of a mother carrying a sleeping child in a troop hold, all of it leans against the currents. We tasted it, we drank it, we made of it a strand in the braid, and the braid grew strong. Sometimes a taste came through that was sour, the desire of a rogue traitor to steal a march on a rival, the cold amusement of a planetary governor who had never stood in a manufactorum and thought himself the same size as the worlds he taxed. The iron certainty of a commissar who had forgotten the faces of the men whose lives he spent. Those flavors rode the light as well, because we do not choose who asks for our help. We shine, and the galaxy decides how to use what we give. Between pulses of work, the memories we had thought lost found a way to speak, not in words. Words belong to mouths and lungs. This was a flow of image and sensation across the lattice we had become. The scribe girl remembered the precise pattern left by a broken lumen inside a corridor, and I saw it as if I had walked there. The Prometheum worker remembered a joke told in a refinery that had been told for 3 generations, and we laughed without mouths, and the sound made the harmonics richer. The youth remembered the first time he had taken a sibling by the hand and promised to come back by nightfall, and though he had kept the promise, then he could not keep this one. And the ache of it made the light lean forward a little harder. The woman of the soil remembered a weed no one could ever quite pull up, and it taught us something about holding when the warp clawed at the edges of our reach. That was how we did not break. Not through strength the machine had imposed, but through the exchange of small human reliquaries that men carry without knowing. Ships flickered at the edge of us like moths at a lantern. Most stayed outside the glass of our light, careful, grateful, pressing their eyes against the brightness, and then turning their bows to follow safe channels. Some came too close. Sometimes it was accident. A navigator blinked at the wrong moment, and a storm moved in a way that could not be predicted, and the prow slid nearer to the fence than anyone wanted. Sometimes it was hunger. A pirate with a new engine thought he could take a shorter line and shave days, and he shaved skin from his soul instead. We felt them scrape us. We felt the warp lick at their hulls. We felt when the fence broke and the wolves came through. When those ships died, we tasted it, and the taste did not fade quickly. There was a glitter in the current that I learned to fear. It was the glitter of promises made by things that hated promise. It came in voices that offered shortcuts and revenge and a life without duty, and sometimes it came in the soft tone of comfort. "You have done enough," it would whisper at our fence. "Rest. The song of the Emperor is too harsh for you. There are other singers who will take your place. Sleep." The whisper always came when the range of the Astronomicon had been forced wide, when the throne beneath us groaned and the adepts fed it with lives in greater number. When storms moved through the warp like black continents, the whisper wanted us to consent. Consenting would have let it in. We did not consent. Consent is a word small enough to hold even when everything else is being taken. We held it the way the woman held to her weed, and the way the youth had held his sibling's hand. We said no, and in the saying, the fence held. Far away in another corner of the galaxy, we felt a mass approach that was not like the wolves. It was not hunger for corruption. It was hunger for matter. It erased the taste of everything in its wake. Worlds had voices that could be heard from here if you knew how to listen. They chimed like bells, or whispered like forests, or growled like deserts in a crosswind. In the path of that mass, the voices went out as if someone had placed a hand over their mouths. We pushed light toward a chain of worlds sitting ahead of that tide, and we felt the rush of men and women filling transports, the terror of children carried up rampways that had never moved so fast, the grim focus of commanders who knew that some would be left behind because the numbers did not love anyone. We felt the navigators draw from us with the care of surgeons, and convoys kicked away toward routes we opened through gaps that looked like fissures in bone. Behind the convoys, the mass arrived and ate the voices of oceans and fields. We heard nothing. We learned that silence is not always peace. There were other silences. The old ones buried beneath tomb worlds slid out of sleep, and their wake was a cold that rejected us. They did not sing. They did not listen. They were absence dressed in armor and will. When our light reached their systems, it passed over them like music over stone. It reached the humans walking on those surfaces, if any remained, and helped them see a way to leave. But it did not touch the old metal mines. That boundary taught us humility. Our work is not to rule. It is to keep open the roads between the islands that still float. Once I saw a flash that did not belong to our age, a memory that swept through the lattice like a comet. It was not mine. It was not any voice near me. It was a fallen star of recollection older than any of us. And for a breath, I saw armies in armor that looked like the custodians but were not the same. Golden lines crashing against a tide of betrayal. Bridges of light breaking, names shouted that no ship now carries. Pain in that memory was bright and perfect. It was not the pain of dying in a chair. It was the pain of killing a dream so that history could limp on. The flash burned out, and we returned to the measured effort of keeping ships from being eaten by a place that hates travelers. The throne beneath us had a rhythm of failure and recovery that became a second sky under our work. The adepts tended it with rites that were half mathematics and half superstition, and sometimes the recovery did not come quickly. On those days, the burn ran hotter through our ranks. Souls that had been with us for a few pulses let go and disappeared. When that happened, the braid changed shape and we felt a flinch race along it. Places that had relied on one person's steadiness buckled for a breath, and the whole choir stumbled, and the Emperor's weight came down and held us until we could find a new configuration. New voices entered often. The black ships returned with harvest and ceremony. We felt them long before they docked. They were heavy with fear and relief and resignation. Sisters of Silence moved through their compartments, and their presence smoothed the surface of the warp against the hulls so that the small parasites could not grip. When the hatches opened and the holds emptied into the Mechanicus basilicas, the adeno smell of human crowds spilled through corridors that we had once walked. That smell reached us as a ghost through the conduits. Some of those crowds became astropaths and were not bound to us. We felt their sanctioning at the edge of perception, the scouring and the sealing, the moment when a mind is burned cleaner than bone and then set to the work of being a listening post on 1,000 worlds. Some became nothing we could detect. Some became us. The first breath of a new voice inside the choir is a small surprise every time. It is like finding a spring behind a rock you had passed 1,000 times without looking. The new voice looks around. It tests the edge of the light and finds where it fits. And sometimes it cries wordlessly and we hold it while it cries. And sometimes it takes position without comment. And sometimes it tries to fight, and we hold it until the fight stops wasting power. Then it sings. We are not saints. We are not made better by dying this way. I discovered that quickly. Jealousy flows in the lattice like any other part of weather. The Prometheum worker held more space than I did, and there were moments when the work asked me for what I did not have. And he had it, and a bitterness rose like smoke. It passed. He carried me in the next pulse when I slipped. The scribe girl learned faster than any of us how to feel the navigator's tug, and part of me envied the ease with which threads bent under her attention. It passed when she guided a medical convoy clear of a whirlpool that would have devoured 10,000 beds. We were not saints, but we were honest with each other because there is no room for disguises here. You meet a mind in its underclothes, and that is that. We fail. We also succeed. There was a moment when a patrol pinned at the edge of a system begged for a line that did not exist. A storm the size of continents rolled where the chart said quiet should be. We pushed. The Emperor laid his hand. The scribe girl opened a channel that was no channel. The youth braced the edge of it. The woman's roots held it from tearing. The Prometheum worker burned, and I burned, and the beam cut for a heartbeat where no beam should be. The patrol slipped through. 3 ships mated, 1 did not. We felt the one that did not as a knot in the current for a long time after, a weight that did not settle until enough work had been done above it to force it down into the silt. I tried once to remember the exact cadence of my mother's voice when she said my name. The choir let me try. The image formed at arm's length, grainy. The sound like a recording copied too many times. I could not bring it into focus. I let it go, and the letting go did not break me. I found instead the exact feeling of the small scar on my left knee from when I had fallen on a stair with a broken edge when I was 8. And for a moment the choir was balanced on that small pain like a pot set down on a single tile. In that moment the light did not waver. I learned that the size of a memory has nothing to do with the work it can do. Across the centuries that fold in this place, I felt a world die by inches under a siege. Supplies ran thin. Civilians were hardened into providers of bodies rather than prayers. The garrison held and held and held until the outer wall was a shadow and the inner wall was dust, and still a message came once a day from a basement where an astropath sat with blood on her teeth and asked for a corridor. Any corridor. Even one lined with knives. We made a corridor that bit like a mouthful of broken glass. The convoy bled through it, and when the last ship fell clear, the astropath's voice went out like a candle. We carried the weight of that extinguishing with a kind of pride that has sorrow braided into it. There are chords you can only play once and should. I slept once. I think it was sleep. The throne fell into a quiet that had the shape of exhaustion. The adepts were busy above us with repairs that sounded like hymns sung to metal. The Emperor's presence withdrew, as a tide does from a flat beach, and left our feet on wet sand. The choir relaxed into a hum that did not ask anything of us except to remember the names of ourselves. In that hum, I drifted to an edge where Terra was a sphere of heavy light and the palace rose like a cliff at the middle of that light, and I saw the street where my hab had been, and it was not there because that street was too small to appear from here. But I knew where it should be, and that was enough. A sister of silence walked a corridor near where my feet had once gone to work each morning, her bare head turned slightly as if listening to something that hated her. She looked tired in a way that no ritual could cure. I loved her in that moment with a gratitude that had no romance in it, only recognition of the price she paid for being what she was. I slept and woke, and the throne found its rhythm again, and the work resumed. The adepts brought more bodies to the thrones. The numbers never failed. 1,000 each day is a number a man cannot feel, but a lattice can. It tightens the weave and then loosens it. It is the breathing of our species. I asked the presence that had said it was sorry if this would be forever. I did not use words. I offered the shape of the question. The answer came in a shape like a hand resting on a table near yours. It is not forever because nothing is. It is for as long as it must be. The answer did not contain hope the way I had understood hope when I still had a lung to sigh with. It contained endurance. Endurance is a hard food. It builds muscle. It leaves you hungry. I accepted it because there was nothing else to eat. Sometimes, through cracks that we do not show to the adepts, personal grief slipped loose. The youth found the memory of a doorway in the lower hive where he had carved his initials and those of a girl he had dared kiss once. The carving was shallow and clumsy. He had been 15. We looked at it with him. It became ours, and in becoming ours, it became less painful. The Prometheum worker found the memory of a song that a refinery crew sang when a fire had finally been brought to heel without killing a man, and we sang it without mouths. And the warp listened with a scowl and could do nothing with it. The woman of the soil found the memory of a handful of dirt that had never been entirely dead, a handful she had stolen from a sacred dome and never told anyone about, and she pressed it into our palms, and it left grit there that made the next beam steadier. I found a corner of my father's coat, not the smell this time, but the feel of the fabric, a cheap weave with a snag that he had never mended. I ran my finger over that snag in the space where fingers are habits rather than flesh, and when the next request came from a frigate limping behind a shattered fleet, I held the snag and the request became a line I could throw to them without missing. We learned the names of storms. Some were old, some were new. The old ones the navigators already knew how to read, and we only had to hold the light steady while they traced their charts. The new ones changed shape when you looked at them. We learned to look while thinking of something else, counting cracks in a ceiling plate, the rhythm of the steps from the hab to the first junction, 9, then 12, then 4, then the lift. The first line of the primer, repeated until the words stopped meaning and became only sounds that set the jaw in a useful way. We learned to look by not looking, and that trick became a tool that saved ships. There came a day when a pilgrim fleet asked to be guided to Terra. The request brushed us like moth wings, delicate, sincere, foolish. We would have loved to refuse. Terra does not need more mouths and more feet and more dreams to break underfoot. We do not refuse. We shone. The fleet arrived. They disembarked, and somewhere near a gate where statues pretend to be merciful, a child looked up and believed that the palace was where prayers go to live. We held our tongues because tongues were not required for our work, and also because there are lies that help a species keep walking. We do not decide which ones to correct. We keep the road open, and we bleed until the road looks clean. In the far dark, the eye looked back, an ulcer in the fabric of things, and on the days when its gaze swung across our beam, Creatures leaned against our fence with both hands and smiled. The smile had too many teeth and the wrong number of eyes. We did not smile back. The Emperor's hand pressed. We sang until our throats that were no longer throats felt raw. The fence held. The smile withdrew and became a different smile for a different road. Then a green tide boiled somewhere out beyond a cluster of mining worlds. It smelled of iron and oil and the happiness of breaking. Our light does not move those tides. It shows men how to be elsewhere. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes a war boss is cheated of a fight he would have won and is forced to seek another fight, and on the road to it he finds a different fate. We never see that part. We see only the ships that slip away with paint scorched and shields cracked and crews too tired to cheer. The throne groaned again. The adepts cut the numbers thinner. The day had dragged more from us than usual, and the night did not look ready to give anything back. In the lull, the scribe girl set a thought upon the lattice that was shaped like a question and a dare at once. "Do you regret it?" she asked, and she did not say what it was. The Prometheum worker set down his answer like a tool he had used for a lifetime. "I regret not learning the names of my apprentices. I regret nothing about this." The youth put down a picture of a doorway with initials carved wrong because his hand had shaken. He regretted that the line of the letter had wavered. The woman put down a handful of soil she had stolen that day from the dome. She did not regret stealing it. "I placed the feel of the snag in my father's coat, and the night in which I had stood up to a foreman who had tried to dock 3 men for a fault that was his. I had not won. I had not lost anything worth more than pride. I did not regret the standing. We arranged our regrets like small stones at the base of a beam, and the beam did not fall. There is a lie I had believed when I was breathing air in rooms with ceilings. I had believed that sacrifice is a grand thing that arrives with banners. It is not. Sacrifice is a task in a list written by another hand. You pick it up because it is next, and because not picking it up makes you into someone you dislike. If there is grandeur in it, it is the grandeur of simple repetition done well. That is the truth of our work. We repeat the act of holding back a darkness that never sleeps until it looks like the darkness is sleeping. We repeat it again when everyone relaxes. We repeat it when the machine fails and when it is repaired. We repeat it when the Emperor is near and when he is far, and when we cannot tell which is which. The question of whether it is worth it does not arrive here very often. There is not enough empty space for it to sit down. On the day when it did arrive, it came from a line of transport ships rerouted through a narrow channel we had scoured open like a scar. A single packet of thought tumbled from a bridge where a captain stood with both hands on a rail and asked us, without knowing to whom she spoke, whether her crew would ever understand what had been paid for their safe passage. The answer that rose from the lattice was not an answer. It was a shrug. Perhaps, perhaps not. It does not change the bill. We let the packet go and the convoy slid through, and afterward we listened to the far low clatter of Mechanicus hymnals and the closer soft breathing of men and women locked to thrones. We went on singing. The days inside the Astronomicon did not feel like days anymore. Not as I had once measured them by chimes and lumen shifts, but as pulses, contractions, and expansions, a breathing that was not lungs but the stretch and strain of psychic light. In those pulses, I learned that individuality was not destroyed in a moment, but worn down as stone is worn by water, slowly, relentlessly, until edges that once felt sharp become smooth. And I wondered how long before I would no longer remember where my stone ended and another began. We sang, not with mouths or throats, but with the shape of thought itself, woven together by the will of the Emperor. And through that weaving, I felt the scale of our prison. It was not only a choir of the living, but a mausoleum of centuries. For here voices of the newly bound blended with remnants of those long since burned away, echoes so faint they were more residue than presence. Yet the lattice remembered them, and sometimes in the ebb between pulses, I would feel the ghost of a laughter that had belonged to someone consumed centuries ago, or the outline of a prayer that had been whispered 10,000 times before dissolving. These remnants were not company, but they were proof that our suffering had been repeated for so long that the grooves were now part of the machine. The Emperor's weight pressed always, his hand vast, his sorrow heavy, and I began to understand why sorrow was the only word large enough. He was no longer human in any sense that could be measured, but fragments of the man remained preserved within that divine immensity, like insects trapped in amber. His sorrow was not pity, not comfort, but a recognition that he saw us, that he felt each extinguishing, and that he carried the burden of knowing it would never be enough. When his gaze brushed across us, the choir shuddered, for it was like standing beneath a storm whose clouds stretched across the sky of the galaxy itself, a storm that mourned as it destroyed. And through that contact, we glimpsed what he saw. We saw the warp open in great tides of hatred where the eye of terror pulsed, a wound that never healed, its borders vomiting daemons in numbers that would drown worlds if not for the fence of our light. We saw orc empires swell, their warbands gathering until the void itself shook with their laughter and their crude engines. We saw tyrannid fleets devour the voices of entire sectors, leaving behind nothing but silence more absolute than vacuum, silence that rang louder than screams. We saw Necron tombs flicker with green fire as armies older than our race rose in mechanical precision, rejecting life as an error and returning to a galaxy that had forgotten it was theirs. We felt the despair of men and women on planets that would not survive another season, who prayed to the Emperor not because they expected rescue, but because prayer was all they had left to give. And always ships moved through us, across us, along the lanes we carved into the warp with our burning souls. Ships heavy with soldiers who would die nameless in battles their commanders did not survive to report. Ships filled with merchants whose greed drove them as much as the need of their cargo. Ships of pilgrims whose belief was fierce enough to cut even into the black hunger of the warp. Each one leaned upon us, begged of us, demanded of us, and we could not refuse. There was no refusal in this place. We gave, and in giving, were consumed. I felt pieces of myself slip further with each pulse. At first, I thought I could anchor myself to memory, to names, to scars. I repeated the scar on my cheek, the name of my father, the smell of the manufactorum, as if these talismans could hold against the tide. But memory frays when each pulse stretches across 1,000 worlds. It frays when the Emperor himself sifts through you like sand, cataloging what can be used and leaving behind only dust. There came a moment when I could no longer recall the face of the girl I had loved for 3 weeks, only that I had once loved, and then even that certainty thinned. The choir held me when I staggered. The Prometheum workers' stubborn rhythm braced me. The scribe girl's quick thread stitched my unraveling edges. We leaned on one another in ways we never could have in life, because here nothing could be hidden. Jealousy, fear, pride, defiance, all flowed through the lattice alongside endurance, loyalty, and scraps of love. We were naked minds arranged into a machine, and the only armor was honesty. Once, in what might have been a day, but might also have been a century, the Emperor pressed harder than usual, and in that pressure we glimpsed not only his sorrow, but his weariness. 10,000 years of carrying the weight of a species had bent even him. He showed us visions, not out of cruelty, but because his own thoughts leaked into ours. We saw fleets lost to storms when the Astronomicon flickered for only an instant. We saw daemonic tides clawing against the fence with such hunger that even the custodians above had trembled. We saw worlds burning not because of enemies, but because Imperial commanders had chosen to scour them rather than let them fall. The Emperor carried all of these in silence, and in silence we shared them, until silence itself became heavier than sound. In the lattice, time made less and less sense. There were pulses where I thought perhaps only hours had passed since I had sat in the throne, my flesh convulsing against needles. But then there were other pulses where I was certain that centuries had slid by, that entire generations of mankind had risen and fallen while I burned here in a choir that could not stop. The line between these certainties blurred until I no longer trusted either. What remained constant was the work. Ships still called, pilgrims still prayed, wars still demanded their transports and their convoys. The warp still pressed and hated and watched. We still sang. And always the Emperor pressed his sorrow into us, binding us into a weapon no man could refuse to hold. In that endless repetition, something inside me changed. I ceased to measure myself as I once had. I was not a man with a name and a history. I was a thread in the Emperor's loom, and though I still remembered that I had once been Rin Malvek, the truth of that name no longer mattered. What mattered was that I could still burn, still hold the fence against the wolves, still lend my voice to the beacon that kept mankind alive. The choir whispered to me that this was enough, and though the part of me that remembered the hab, the picked frame, the scar on my cheek, still wept for what had been lost, the larger part that had become lattice, light, sacrifice, knew it was true, and so we endured. The song began to stutter, and the first time it happened, I thought it was my own failing, a slip in the weave, a loss of concentration that left a gap in the fence. But then I felt the entire choir buckle as if the fabric had been tugged from beneath us. The Astronomicon trembled. The throne below us groaned like a beast that had been lashed too many times and now refused to rise, and the adepts above rushed with their liturgies and their rites of repair. And even through the haze of our dissolution, I felt their urgency. Something inside the machine was breaking. It had been breaking for centuries, perhaps, but now the cracks showed themselves. Our harmonics wavered, and where the fence thinned, the warp pressed close with claws and grins, and navigators cried out in their sealed bridges because the path faltered and shifted under their sight. The Emperor's presence descended heavier than it had ever been, not as sorrow, but as command. He pressed us tighter together, drove us to sing louder, to burn hotter, to cover the wound in the lattice with the sheer weight of will. We obeyed because obedience was no longer choice but instinct, the marrow's answer to his demand. The burn grew fierce. Souls that had lingered for what felt like years were consumed in pulses, flaring and guttering until they were gone. The choir reeled as gaps opened where once voices had held steady, and the Emperor filled them with new sacrifices dragged screaming into the thrones. Their terror slammed into us like iron dropped into water, disrupting every chord, but in time they blended, unwillingly, inevitably, into the structure. We lost count of how many were fed into the choir in that failing. It was more than 1,000, more than the daily number the Catechism spoke of. It was a harvest so great the air itself tasted of new fear. I felt my own edges thinning, the outline of what I had been growing transparent. I tried to remember my scar and failed. I tried to remember the pict of my parents and could no longer recall their faces. Even the snag on my father's coat slipped from me, and when it went, I realized that the last thread of my selfhood was unraveling. I was dissolving not into the choir, but into nothing. I reached out across the lattice, clinging to the Prometheum worker's stubborn rhythm, to the scribe girl's quick patterns, to the soil woman's rooted defiance. But even they flickered now. Their shapes distorted, their presence stretched thin. The warp laughed. I felt it. Shapes pressed against the fence with glee, sensing the weakness. They whispered bargains with honeyed tones, promising that if we simply stopped, if we simply let go, we could rest. They said the Emperor had lied, that his sorrow was a mask, that we were not his children but his cattle. They said eternity could be ours if only we abandoned the fence. Some voices in the choir quavered. I felt their hesitation. I felt one slip. The instant it did, the warp tore through, a claw pushing into the light, a scream that carried knives. And the Emperor's hand crushed it shut with such violence that the voice who had faltered was annihilated completely, not absorbed, not remembered, erased. The warning was clear. We would burn until he commanded otherwise. And so we burned. In our burning, I saw the galaxy again. Not as visions of sorrow this time, but as desperate need. I saw Imperial fleets stranded at the edge of storms, calling out for our guidance with the desperation of drowning men. I saw guard regiments massed on a barren world where the horizon burned green with orc fire, waiting for transports that would never arrive if we faltered. I saw pilgrims packed into holds so tight they could barely breathe, children weeping in the arms of mothers who promised that Terra would answer their prayers. All of them leaned on us. All of them begged that we not fail, that we not collapse into the dark. We held for them because there was no other reason to hold. The Emperor's sorrow did not matter anymore. Our regrets did not matter. What mattered was that the fence remained, that the beacon shone, that humanity had one more day and another, even if it cost us everything. The throne groaned louder. The adepts' hymns cracked with static. I felt their fear leaking through the cracks of their rituals. They knew what we felt, that the Golden Throne was dying, that the system designed to sustain the Emperor was crumbling under the weight of 10,000 years. We were being asked to fill gaps that could not be filled, and yet we obeyed. The Emperor pressed harder, drawing deeper, using us not only as choir, but as fuel, not only as light, but as fire. Some of us went out completely, leaving behind no echo. The lattice mourned, but tightened. I felt myself sliding toward that same fate. The edges of my thought blurred until I was not sure which chords were mine and which belonged to the choir. Sometimes I thought I was the Prometheum worker, burning hot and steady. Sometimes I thought I was the soil woman, stubborn and rooted. Sometimes I thought I was the scribe girl, weaving delicate threads. Perhaps I was all of them now. Perhaps none of us remained separate. The Emperor's presence thickened until it was everything. He was no longer the hand pressing us into unity. He was the unity itself. His sorrow was gone, replaced by command so absolute that it had no room for pity. He was will made flesh, and we were that will extended across the void. And still, somewhere within, the fragment of him that remembered humanity whispered, "I am sorry." That whisper was smaller now, weaker, almost extinguished, but it kept me clinging to the fence. It kept me singing even as myself unraveled. And so we endured, burning brighter as the throne groaned, burning hotter as the warp pressed, burning until endurance itself became indistinguishable from annihilation. The song had no ending, but I did. I felt it as a thinning, a fraying of all that had once been called Rin Malvik, until even the name was only a faint mark on the surface of thought. I tried to hold it, whispered it into the weave, repeated it against the tides, but the lattice did not care. The Emperor did not care. The galaxy did not care. 1,000 new voices joined. 1,000 old voices went out. And in that endless exchange, my small resistance was erased. The snag in my father's coat was gone. The scar on my cheek was gone. The pict of my parents had dissolved into nothing. What remained was the song itself, the beam of light that burned through the warp, the only thing that still mattered. And in the final moments of myself, I felt the Emperor more clearly than I ever had. He was not a man. He was not even a god as I had been taught. He was a burden given shape, a weight that had endured for 10 millennia, a sorrow that had been reforged into command because command was the only form of survival. He felt me go. He felt all of us go. He remembered each of us for a breath, then turned us into fuel, into resonance, into fire. I hated him and I loved him, and both feelings were the same because they had no meaning in this place. He was everything. He was the reason we burned. And then I was gone. Not gone as in erased, for my threads remained woven into the choir, but gone as in separate, gone as in no longer an I but only a we. We burned across the warp, our light carving safe lanes for ships that would never know the price. We kept the wolves at bay with our screams, and the screams became music, and the music became silence, and in that silence, humanity survived another day and another and another. We felt the galaxy moving above us. We felt the march of soldiers who would die in forgotten wars. We felt the hunger of children soothed for one more night by rations. We felt the prayers of pilgrims offered to a God who had long ago ceased to hear but who still answered with light. We felt worlds burn. We felt worlds rise. We felt the endless cycle of survival at any cost. And we knew that cost was us. The Astronomicon did not dim. It could not dim, not while we fed it. The Emperor's sorrow did not ease. It could not ease, not while the galaxy demanded its tithe. And so the work continued, unending, unbroken, a song that had no beginning and would have no end until the last voice burned away and silence swallowed everything. I was part of that song now. I was part of him. I was part of the Imperium's only hope. And though nothing of Rin Malvik remained to mourn, some faint trace of what I had been whispered still in the weave, a last echo carried into the eternity of sacrifice. "I am sorry," the Emperor whispered back. "So am I." And then there was only the light.